Hi, Jane. Jane, are you there? Hi, everybody. We're just waiting for the host, Jane.
Mute. Here, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Phew.
You
Two
want to
hours
start?
ago, I
Yeah, you
found
want?
out,
Yeah, go ahead.
2 hours ago, I found out that the last Windows update had eliminated my microphone and and my the other part, the audio from my computer.
So you have no audio or microphone?
Well, obviously, I have both of them now, but it was a process.
Okay. Okay, so you want to start, presenting, and then I'll talk about, what are we going to talk about today? Um, so today we have Jane, who does our presentation on powerful women, and we're talking about Mayor Gold, and she's obviously famous for her famous saying, "We don't negotiate with terrorists." That was after Munich Olympics, um, or during the Munich Olympics when there was a hostage take, which I think Jane is going to go into. Well, several Israeli Olympians, were um, basically taken over by I forget what it's called, Dark October or Black October group, which is one of the Palestinian freedom. Go ahead.
Black
What was it called?
September.
Black September. Sorry, Black 1 month off. Black September group, and it was actually headed by a very famous or infamous. They call him Dark Prince. Not a lot know about that, and famously there was so many women shot where Mossad or Mayor, or Ms. Gold was able to, locate and terminate a lot of terrorists that were involved in this, which, I forget the name of the, I think it was called Revenge, Operation Revenge. And so that's how, she became very well known for that. So, and Jane is our regular speaker or presenter in regards to uh, presentation on powerful women. She did the Aquitaine. She did the we recently did Rajiv Gandhi, not Gandhi. Was a Pakistani one. I forget her name. So all the famous
Benazir.
uh, Benazir
Benazir
Bhutto,
Bhutto.
Benazir Bhutto, or they call it a cursed family, I guess, or family that caught the curse. Um, so
Excuse me, but there's somebody who's trying to get in, and I'm getting the signal to admit them or not. Should I admit them?
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you go ahead. Admit you have all the rights to do
Okay.
that. So let me know if you're sharing, so that we usually start like 7 minutes past the hour, so we have 3 more minutes, and then once I'm gonna help you admit people, but I'm gonna probably also make somebody who can help us admitting people as well. I see, Anne Rye. Maybe I'll make her a co-host as well, so that if there's any kind of questions, here I see you, Jane,
Yes.
and again for doing this one, just to go through our presentations that are coming up. So today we're doing, Gold Mayor. On next Saturday, we're doing the ancient Archimedean Empire, Cyrus the Great, and his predecessors were the Medes. His grandfather was a Mede. And we know Cyrus from Cyrus Circle. We know Cyrus because he freed Jews. It's in the Bible. He let them, obviously practice their religion after the destruction by Assyrians, Nebuchadnezzar. So that's what the presentation will be about. Also on Thursdays, please join us for regular group meetings with Richard. He's doing the ancient China. He's doing the ancient China. And particularly his presentation, last presentation he had, he was talking about the first emperor, the one people probably know from Terracotta Soldiers. Richard is an amazing presenter. If you have a chance to go to our YouTube channel, it's called History, Fitness, Investing, all three words together. On YouTube channel, you'll see about 300 Richard's presentations, and you'll see about 50 Jane's presentations. 50 or 40, I'm losing count, but she does amazing things, obviously. And you see how amazing of work they do. It's so natural. They do natural research. They look at books, articles, whatever they know from life, from talking to people. Richard is, is still in his studies, but he as Jane can attest, knows a lot. And Jane obviously is very knowledgeable. And Jane had spent some time also in Americas and is very familiar with the ancient Indian culture. And she did a presentation, a very amazing presentation on Mayan culture. So you can check that out as well. Well, besides powerful women presentation, she does Mayan presentations, and at some point we'll probably do Aztecas. Mayan is it's a lost, obviously. And then we also did about the heads. What were they called? Those heads? The Mayan was talking
The
about in there, right?
Olmec head, the Olmec
Yeah,
heads.
Balmy House. Yeah, so everybody needs to check that out too, if you're not familiar with that. I mean, to Europeans, mine had to describe those heads as being extraterrestrial or alien, so to speak. So to them, that was almost like a godly, thing. So, without further ado, I'm going to let Jane go ahead and
Excuse
present.
me,
Okay.
this is Rayanne. Excuse me.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
appreciate being named as co-host, but I'm operating off an iPhone right
Okay.
now, so it might be kind of hard for me to monitor the questions.
I'll do it. Don't worry about it. I was
All
just
right.
if I
Thank you
see
very
somebody
much.
who is joining, they can help us with the operating as well. I'm operating as well, and then Jean also can meet people as she goes as well. So we have three people in that regard. So that's good. It's just backup to backup, just in case. So Jane, go ahead. You have a can you?
Okay. So welcome to my talk on Golda Meir, which I am doing at Zach's request. Thanks a bunch to Zach. All of my other talks about powerful women who are safely dead. Golda is dead, but the issues of her time that surrounded her are very much alive.
Yeah, Jane. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but are you presenting as well something or no?
What?
Are you presenting slides or anything? Because I don't see anything on.
Yeah, let me see if I can get to them.
Okay, thank you.
Where are my slides?
So while you're presenting, I just want to ask a first question. Golda Meir, would you think that she was more a capitalist, communist, or she was more like Zionist? You know, how would you? In what category would you put her in?
Well, uh, she was a socialist, and I'll be getting to that. So anyhow, can you hear me? Oh
Yes,
dear.
we can hear you. We can hear you really
Oh,
well.
okay. Um, there's no way of disentangling Golda Meir from the history of Israel's long gestation and birth as a nation, and up to and including the time of her death. So everything now about Israel is a flashpoint since October 7th. So this one, I'm usually begging on my bended knees for people to interrupt and comment and so forth. And this time, I'm not. I'm going to talk this one through to the end if I survive. And at the end, I hope to have an open discussion where everybody can crosstalk. Now, please remember that this talk is on Golda, a person, and her time, not the current mess. as always, take what you like and leave the rest. Okay, so let us go to share screen. And that's not what I want. I want this. Can you still hear me?
Yes, most certainly, yes.
Okay, so let's go to the very top. There's Golda. And go to
But we don't
slideshow.
see anything.
You don't see anything.
Right.
All right. Um, let me see. Okay, somebody's going to have to let me in again.
Well, you're in. It doesn't give me an opportunity to
Yeah,
let you
I'm
in.
in. Okay, here's my Zoom meeting. And I am having trouble getting the slides to,
Okay, okay. So leave and come back, whatever you want.
okay. Um, so, all right. Let's see if I can do this. There we go. All right. This is a slide.
Still no slide.
Still no slide?
I don't see anything. Sorry. So if you go share, I
Yeah,
think,
I've
and then,
got to share. Actually, I could live without this for,
okay.
oh, wait, maybe this will do it. You got it
Oh,
now?
here it goes. Here it goes. It's
Oh,
perfect. No, it's perfect. Yeah.
okay, good. And let me go to the slideshow. Oh, well, I can't do that. So you'll have to be happy with this one. All right. So this is a map of the Middle East. Um, and this is the way it is to the current day. And I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on it because you guys all know this. So I'll go right away to the slide of their slideshow. I'll go right away. Um, pack, pack to a slide of the area as it was in 1300 BCE. Now, when I was growing up and in my young adult years, there was a feeling that cultures grew in isolation to one another. And trade was something that didn't happen until people were more civilized. And the vision of the Middle East was that Egypt was over here on the left, that Mesopotamia was over there on the right, that, you know, the Hittites hadn't been invented yet, and the real culture was in Greece. In fact, that wasn't the way it was. Um, because everybody is always concerned about who was there first, as if that made any difference. And if it did, we'd all be Native Americans. So, starting with the latest and largest genetic study in which researchers analyzed genetic material from dozens of skeletons found at Canaanite sites across Israel and neighboring countries and compared their DNA, the ancient ones, to the genomics of other ancient populations as well as to modern day groups. And the result was, not surprisingly, there is a deep genetic connection of both Jewish groups today across the diaspora and Arab groups to this part of the world thousands of years ago. And we continue. All of the area around here, was occupied by those tribes. They were Arab, they were Jewish. But you mustn't think that they were all herding stuff, goats and stuff, and that they were sort of uncivilized nomads. In fact, there were cities. Jericho had some famous walls. Jerusalem had piping that went down to underground springs so they could bring up water. It, it varied all over the place. At a certain point in the late part of the third millennium, a guy by the name of Sargon made an Akkadian empire, which you see here. And this is really more important. These were all the resources that were open to him. The eyes are iron, and eventually they would be very important for militaries when they made the transition from bronze to iron. And in the meantime, these little teas, only recently discovered, were tin mines. They didn't have to go to Cornwall for their tin. They had it right here. And that's how you make bronze. So all of this was incredibly important at the time. They didn't know about the oil. Okay, and here, I better get out of that so you can read it. I'll just read it to you. In the third millennium BCE, the city of Ur, which was the birthplace of Abraham, was built. In around 1850, he arrived in Canaan, give or take, all of these a couple of hundred years ago, and nothing really supported by anything other than archaeology and the Bible and, this and that. Around 1450 is supposed to be the Jewish exodus from Egypt. And I know that there is no written record of Jewish people being enslaved and building the pyramids. However, there was a group called the Apiru, who were considered really low class, very bad people, and they were slaves. But of course, slaves are always characterized that way. That's how people justify enslaving them. And they did make an exodus from Egypt, and people thinking maybe Apiru and Hebrew, they sound the same. So maybe that was it. And we have another case of sounds like identification, and that's about the time of the late Bronze Age collapse. Philistines came to the area. It was about the time of King David and his fight with Goliath. And the Philistines are kind of interesting because they're not Palestinians. They sound the same, and no doubt they came from the same. No, they didn't come from the same people. The Palestinians were Arabs, but the Philistines were actually the sea people that kind of made a real pest of themselves in Egypt. And they came from the Aegean area. They were Greek. And about that time, the time of the Bronze Age collapse. Oh, I have a couple of slides about the Philistines while I'm on the subject. Here's the area they came to. As you see, it's pretty much the same kind of area that, the Palestinian Israeli thing is involved with. But here is something very interesting. This little item over here is the Festus disc, and it was found in the Festus Palace on Crete. And this is an actual portrait of a Philistine with a Philistine war bonnet on. And this is a little part of the Festus disc right around here. And you can see your very own Philistine there, which pretty much tapes them for where and when. And so about this time, the late Bronze Age collapse, a Sumerian tribe that wrote in a Semitic language whose alphabet looks a lot like Hebrew headed by a man called Abraham, left the southern Mesopotamian city of Ur, headed north, ultimately settling in Canaan, more or less the rest of today's Israel. At about the same time, the region was invaded by the Philistines. Okay. And Jerusalem was constantly fighting with the Philistines. It was destroyed, let's get back here, by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BCE. And he brought a bunch of the surviving populations, probably pretty women and skilled workers, to Babylon as slaves. Nebuchadnezzar was an equal opportunity employer. He did the same to the Philistines in Gaza. Cyrus the Great, of Persia, took over the Babylonian Empire in 539 and ended the Babylonian captivity the following year. The Jews returned to Canaan and built the second temple, and Philistines returned to Gaza. The temple was destroyed in 7 CE by the Roman Emperor to be Titus, who had a hot love affair with Queen Bernice of Judea, but ditched her when it came down to marrying her or being emperor. Details in my talk on Queen Bernice on YouTube. In 638, Jerusalem surrendered more or less peaceably to Caliph Umar, the second successor to Muhammad. In 1099, however, Jerusalem fell to a crusader army headed by Godfrey de Bouillon. Both Arab and Jews were massacred, almost all of them, if not all, and the city became Christian. The Jewish population didn't recover its numbers until the pogroms of the 19th century scattered Jewish refugees, 2 million from Russia alone, on a desperate search for shelter anywhere. Which brings us to Golda. And there she is, 8 years old. Among the places that seemed safe was Kiev. Here's Golda again, enlarged, and there's Kiev. In the Ukraine. That is where Golda was born, the second daughter of Moshe and Bluma Mavovich, on May 3rd, 1898. 5 babies followed Golda, all of which died within a year of birth. So you can imagine the conditions. The next child, a daughter named Zipka, we'll get the slides here for this, but called Clara, survived. The family kept kosher laws, but I couldn't find any reference regarding Golda's observance after she left home. There was a large Jewish presence in Ukraine, and I recommend a book on this by Isaac Babel containing his stories of the Jewish gangsters he grew up with. And another one of his books describes the brutality of the Red Army invasion then and now. But his was Amen. And Golda's father tried to make a living building furniture. It was touch and go, and the family relocated to Pinsk. There's Pinsk. Until the news came of the orgy of murder, rape, and torture that was the Kishinev pogrom of 1903 in Moldova. Then it was just go. Golda's earliest memory was of her father nailing planks across the door to their home, the only defense he could offer against a pogrom that fortunately bypassed the Mavovich's home. That night made up Moshe's mind. He left for America, planning to return a rich man in 3 years. Bluma, Golda, and her sister stayed behind close to their remaining family. Her mother baked bread and sold the loaves door to door to maintain their small apartment. The city of Pinsk was then almost entirely Jewish. Shana, 9 years older than Golda, became involved in revolutionary politics and handed out pamphlets against the Tsar, an activity that could have cost her her life. She also held illegal meetings in their apartment, and Golda hid and listened to them, learning about socialism and the methods of revolutionary politics. One day, Shana and a friend were assaulted in the streets by an anti-Semite who bashed their heads together and cursed the Jews. They recovered without lasting harm, but Bluma was done with Pinsk. In 1906, the family set out for America. Leaving Russia was risky. Money and possessions were stolen by the police. Children were kidnapped and trafficked. Moshe could only buy fake exit permits, but they did work. The family settled in Milwaukee, and Moshe became a union carpenter. To make ends meet, Bluma opened a grocery store in which Shana refused to work. Her ties with her parents were stressed in many ways, so Golda minded the store in the mornings. This made her late for school and prompted a visit from the truant officer, but at graduation, she was valedictorian of her class. Golda dreamed of becoming a teacher and assimilating into American society, but though Jews were present here from 1684, and by this time were represented among the wealthiest families of New York City, Goldman Sachs, founded in 1869, the textile industry, Levi Strauss, and even held high public office, particularly in the South and the Confederacy. The first Jewish American senator was Julia, Florida, in 1845. Anti-Semitism persisted. Golda was to struggle for several years with the decision to become a Zionist before finally deciding that she would make Aliyah one day and join a kibbutz. The Dreyfus Affair, 1894 to 1906, and reports of Parisian mobs screaming death to the Jews had caused many Jews to give up hope that they would ever be accepted in any European society. Golda was 17 years old when Leo Frank was lynched in Georgia for a murder he did not commit. Perhaps America also was not so good. In Milwaukee, Shana continued her politicking for Zionism and socialism. She wore only black after the death of Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism. Her parents tried to arrange a marriage for her, but she was still in love with Sam, her sweetheart from Pinsk, and yearned for independence. Eventually, she left for a job in Denver amid recriminations from both sides. Sam joined her there and they were married. Golda's parents apparently learned nothing from Shana's estrangement. They refused to allow Golda to pursue a teaching degree, since her mother didn't believe in education for women, and they began looking for a match for her. Golda ran away to Denver and joined Shana and Sam and their new baby. She was 16 years old. Meanwhile, she studied for her teaching degree and corresponded with Morris, a young man she'd met in Milwaukee. Besides their Zionist activities, Shana and Golda raised money to alleviate the poverty of the Jews remaining in Pinsk, and they sent it to a relief agency there. A letter from Golda's father begged her to come home. Her mother was devastated at the loss of both her daughters, and she promised never to interfere again in Golda's life and even support her while she continued her studies. Golda missed her parents, and recently her arguments with Shana were increasing as Shana began to act in loco parentis, in very much their mother's style. Golda went back home, felt she might as well. One day, the news came that Russian troops had shot all 40 members of a relief agency they tried to help for the crime of receiving money from America. That news made up Golda's mind. She would make Aliyah that day. And here I have their wedding. It's a little blurry, I'm sorry. For Golda, return also meant renewal of her friendship with Morris and the development in what seemed like love. He wanted to marry her, but making Aliyah was her non-negotiable condition, and Morris didn't want to. He agreed after the Balfour Declaration promised to give a homeland to the Jews, written in best British upper class rhetoric. That's what it said. It reassured him and many others that Palestine would be a haven for them and not an eternal war zone under foreign occupation. Golda and Morris were married on December 24th, 1917, and the most important rabbi in Milwaukee presided at the cemetery in recognition of Golda's contributions. Her parents, reconciled, were thrilled. The marriage lasted formally until Morris's death in 1951. It was bad for both of them, a union between two fine people who were totally unsuited to one another. Morris was an introvert. He had no social life other than Golda, and he liked it that way because it left him free to read and listen to his record collection. People and their untidy emotions made him uncomfortable, and there is no evidence that he and Golda ever understood each other. And I shall take a sip of water before continuing. Golda was not this. She was upfront emotionally, always aware and interested in the people around her. It shows in her book, in her descriptions of her colleagues, including Ben-Gurion and her other contemporaries in the pantheon of Israeli history, which makes them come alive for the reader. Not only their politics or their appearance, but also their personalities, their foibles, their dress. Her own warmth and sincere care for others glows in her books. And now we come to slide 11. And that is the result of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. There were already strains on the marriage, but Morris kept his word about going to Israel even after the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain, France, parentheses, and Russia, close parentheses, was published by the Manchester Guardian in 2020. That agreement had been signed by the parties in 2016 and was almost certainly known by Earl Balfour before he wrote that so reassuring and totally fake promise of a homeland. Leon Trotsky blew the whistle on it, and Russia was bribed with part of Armenia, that's the green part, to bow out of the rest of the agreement, which split the area into a British, which is pink and red, and French zones, which is blue. Part of each controlled, the dark areas, that is, controlled by the parties, and the rest a zone of influence of the parties. Those are the pastel areas. An area containing Jerusalem would be under international control. However, not phased, the couple stayed for 4 years and arrived in Palestine in 1921, along with Shana, her family, and others, all planning to stay in Israel. Most of them went home after a hard look at the Promised Land. Golda and Morris applied to the Merchavia Kibbutz, or Kutzva, as it was called then, an agricultural collective in the Jezreel Valley. They had to wait in Tel Aviv some months before their application would be considered. And after that, they struggled with acceptance, as the kibbutz didn't feel it could accommodate babies, which would be expected from a married couple, and worried that a woman who lived the soft American life wouldn't be able to tolerate the labor required of all members. Fortunately, because the couple was almost out of money, they were invited for a 1-month trial after Golda's third application, an audition for her, where she made her first acquaintance with the heavy agricultural machines that would be part of her life there. Despite the initial skepticism, they were accepted. And let's go to Golda at that age and at the kibbutz with a very unflattering hat. Almost as if she were challenging her rough-hewed kibbutz family, Golda brought some innovations from her soft life in America, including during her biweekly stint in the kitchen, a tablecloth made from a sheet and flowers in a glass on the table. It earned her some snickers, but her appetite for work and her Capability brought her respect, and her innovations became popular. Golda and Morris had traveled a circuitous route to Palestine. Because of anti-immigrant riots of the Arabs, the Jews were forbidden by the British to disembark there. The nearest harbor open was Naples. From there, they'd taken a scheduled ferry to Alexandria and then a train to Palestine. Relations with the Arabs were showering all this time from a short-lived high during the immediate post-war period. That's post-World War I. The year following their arrival, the so-called Churchill White Paper of 1922, he was the colonial secretary at the time, was issued by the British, who were concerned about alienating their primary source of oil. In an attempt to placate the Arabs by imposing strict limits on Jewish immigration. And a quote from the paper, "It is necessary that the Jewish community in Palestine should be able to increase its numbers by immigration. This immigration, though, cannot be so great in volume as to exceed whatever may be the economic capacity of the country. It is essential to ensure that the immigrants should not be a burden upon the people of Palestine as a whole, that includes the Arabs, and that they should not deprive any section of the present population of their employment." The British were to make those determinations. Worse yet, the paper specified that the promised Jewish homeland of the Balfour Declaration had really never meant what Chaim Weizmann and Arnold Rothstein thought when they were striving to persuade Balfour to issue it. The homeland wasn't supposed to be a nation, but a community to which Jews around the world could look to with pride. Churchill's paper was meant to reassure the Arabs that they need have no fear of subordination. Their language and culture would be preserved, but they trusted nothing British, since the promise that T.E. Lawrence of Arabia had given them during the war to recruit Arab warriors for the British side. And that promise was an independent homeland of their own. And it had also vanished with Sykes-Picot, which they learned was signed while they were fighting and dying for that promised homeland. The forced marriage of two peoples whose conflicting national aspirations had been dangled before them and then snatched away was to be presided over by Viscount Herbert Samuel, himself a Zionist and a good secular Jew, as were many in Palestine, but a better team player for the British. He'd even proposed locating the Jewish homeland next to the Suez Canal so the Jews could keep an eye on it for Britain. Things got worse from that point on. Golda and Morris were desperately poor. Golda missed the camaraderie of the kibbutz, the freedom that communal child rearing brought her. Oh, I skipped ahead. Okay. Back at Merhavia, despite Golda's derided insistence on ironing her clothes each morning, she won acceptance. More than that, they chose Golda as their delegate to the Convention of Kibbutzim in 1922. She first met Ben-Gurion there. He was familiar with her work in America, and she was given a job raising money for a social service organization called Pioneer Women. Part of the job was to meet with foreign dignitaries, and she escorted the wife of one British one on a tour of Palestine through Jewish settlements and Bedouin camps, seeing for herself other sides to the land that she was now living in. Golda was very happy. Morris wasn't. He hated the kibbutz. He hated that Golda was taking on more work. He was lonely and unable to reach out. His misery was compounded by a case of malaria that put him in the hospital and nearly killed him. He was treated successfully, but during his long recuperation, he was weak and couldn't work. And so the kibbutz kicked him out. Golda left as well. The bait was Morris's consent to father a child who would be raised by them, not by a commune. Menachem, born in 1924, and Sarah in 1926 were the results. In Jerusalem, where the couple settled, they were both unhappy. Morris wasn't fully well, but he had to work so the family could eat. He found a job at Histadrut, the weird countrywide amalgam of labor union and public works department. The work was hard and paid only in promissory notes, script, low in face value, and discounted heavily when presented instead of cash. They were desperately poor. Golda missed the camaraderie of the kibbutz, the freedom that communal child rearing brought her on the days when she wasn't working in the nursery. They must have had a bunch more babies at the kibbutz. This was when she realized that the marriage was a failure. The couple separated, and Golda and the children moved to Tel Aviv in 1928. Morris would visit on weekends. Golda returned briefly to the kibbutz with her children. But in 1932, Sarah developed kidney problems that became life-threatening, and Golda took her back to the States and successful treatment, while Morris stayed with Menachem, who was starting cello studies. Father and son drew closer over their shared love of music. Menachem would later go to Manhattan School of Music here in New York and become a professional musician. While in America for Sarah's treatment, Golda worked as a fundraiser for the Histadrut's Council of Women. And on her return, she was offered a position on the executive committee. She was soon promoted to head of Histadrut's political department. The Orthodox Jewish religion, in which Golda grew up, is not obscure about the duties of a woman in raising children and keeping a kosher home. Golda, the socialist worker, struggled with guilt. Here is what she wrote from Golda Meir Speaks Out, edited by Maurice Sirkin. I am going to quote quite a bit of it because I am in awe of her ability to communicate the most intimate feelings and her pitiless honesty about herself. I wonder if these feelings afflict working mothers. There are so many of them today. Well, everything seems all right, but one look at reproach from the little one when the mother goes away and leaves it with a stranger is enough to throw down the whole structure. That look can be withstood only by an almost superhuman effort of will. At the best of times, there is a perpetual consciousness at the back of the mother's mind that her child lacks a mother's tenderness. A borrowed mother becomes the model for the child. And there are times after a weary, careful work day when the mother looks at her child almost as if she did not recognize it, a feeling of alienation from her nearest and dearest. That feeling of alienation can and often does occur in even more serious form when the mother always stays at home and cannot develop with her children. Can we today measure our devotion to husband and children by our indifference to everything else? Yet a working mother suffers even in her chosen activity. She has the feeling that her work is not as productive as that of a man or an unmarried woman. This internal inner division, this double pull, this alternating feeling of unfilled duty toward her family and tomorrow toward her work. This is the burden of the working mother. Meanwhile, the world was getting darker. America struggled with the Great Depression, and runaway inflation hit Germany. In 1932, America elected FDR. The following year, Germany voted in the party whose leader was Adolf Hitler. In 1938, more than 300,000 Germans, mostly Jewish refugees, applied for U.S. entry permits. A little over 20,000 applicants were approved. The Jews of Palestine were willing to accept however many came. But the Churchill White Paper, giving the British power to limit immigration to Palestine as a whole, remember, was still in effect, and the Arab part of that whole wanted no more Jews. Kristallnacht jolted the issue into world consciousness, as Russian pogroms never had. I mean, Germany was civilized, right? As a response, Neville Chamberlain's government issued a new white paper in May of 1939. It called for the establishment of a Jewish national home in an independent Palestinian state within 10 years, rejecting the Peel Commission's proposal of partitioning Palestine. But it also limited Jewish immigration to a total of 75,000 over 5 years and ruled that further immigration would be determined by the Arab majority, which was in Section 2. Jews were restricted from buying Arab land in all but 5% of the mandate territory, Section 3. By 1944, only 51,000 of the allowed 75,000 permits had been issued. By 1944, of course, it was far too late for far too many. Golda attended the Evian Conference of 32 Nations in 1939 from the 6th to the 13th of June, called by FDR to consider the problem of involuntary emigrants, refugees. Its final report expressed horror at the number of these refugees and listed all the disruptions to peace, economy, and culture that such a human flood could bring. And the results were: 1, the Dominican Republic, alone of the nations, all 32, agreed to take in 100,000 Jews. A committee was established for further study. At no point in the text is the source of the involuntary emigration named. In My Life, which is her wonderful autobiography, on which I lean very heavily, all I know is that the state of Israel might not have come into being for many years after 1939 if that British war within a war that was increasing Jewish immigration had not been waged so ferociously and with such insane persistence. She explains, it was only when the British government decided, in the face of all reason or humanity, to place itself like an iron wall between us and whatever chance we had of rescuing Jews from the hands of the Nazis, that we realized that political independence was not something that we could go on regarding as a distant aim. When the war was over, when the full toll of European Jewish lives was known and the conditions of their deaths revealed, ship after ship was hired to bring the survivors to Palestine. But the British still refused to ease the immigration quota. The few slots remaining in the monthly quotas were filled from the ship, and the rest redirected to squalid camps in Cyprus. When Italy refused to let 2 shiploads of refugees depart, a hunger strike was declared by those on board. Golda joined her colleagues in the strike and began fasting in Jerusalem a few days before Passover. Despite initial derision from the Mandate government, the strike succeeded, and on May 8th, the boats were allowed to depart, although only 1,000 refugees would be allowed to enter Palestine. President Truman supported the Palestinian Jews in their readiness to absorb the immigrants, proposing that 100,000 be admitted at once and the 1939 White Paper be abolished. The British Foreign Secretary, Bevan, replied to these pleas on June 29, 1946, by sending 100,000 soldiers, augmented by 2,000 police, into the kibbutzes, putting villages and cities under martial law and raiding the Jewish Agency and other Palestinian Jewish institutions. Tipped off in time, most evidence of Haganah activity and arms was successfully hidden, but the members they found of all these agencies were sent to a detention camp. Golda wasn't detained, and so she became the acting head of the political department of the Jewish Agency, the operative wing of the World Zionist Organization, which was the world's largest NGO at the time. There was immense pressure to take action before the violent wing of Jewish resistance, that's the Irgun and the Stern group, could provoke even more repression and equal and opposite pressure from those who favored violence. Meanwhile, she went down to the shore as teenage Jewish children were wading out to waiting ships and bearing the now illegal immigrants on their shoulders to the shore, but not to safety. The British were still combing the country to find every illegal entrant and deport them to the camps, and the Irgun was capturing and executing British soldiers. And by February 1947, the British decided they had enough and dumped the problem on the UN. I should mention in passing that they made a mess of offloading India just 6 months later. 1 million people died in that one. The United Nations Special Committee on Palestine arrived in June 1947 in time to actually witness the forcible caging and deportation of 4,500 Jews who would be returned to Germany, of all places. According to Golda, the shock of seeing that contributed to their final recommendation. 8-3 voted in favor of partition of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states, with Jerusalem divided. The minority for one mixed Arab-Jewish state. The Arabs were in favor of none of the above. The British were demanding Arab-Jewish unanimity. Now the full UN vote would vote on the recommendation. The roll call took place on November 29th, 1948. The result, 33 in favor of partition, including America and the Soviet Union, about the last thing they agreed on for a couple of decades. 13 opposed and 10 abstained, including Britain. Golda gave a speech from her balcony to the crowd celebrating in the plaza beneath, appealing to the Arabs for acceptance and peace. The answer was an ambush, killing 7 Jews and setting up the commercial center of Jerusalem on fire. The next step was war, and Israel had no money for war. Golda was sent back to the USA to her old job as a fundraiser. She came back with $50 million. It was enough. The state of Israel was proclaimed on May 4th, 1948. President Truman recognized the new state that same day. Golda had enlisted him in the cause some months before. And back she went to America, raising another $100 million. Half would go to dispossessed Jews in Europe. But again, it was enough. An Arab invasion, primarily from Egypt, aided by Jordan and Syria, stalled on June 11th, and after a truce of 28 days and a renewed Jewish offensive ended, and Arab troops were withdrawn from Israel. And Golda's next assignment was ambassadress from the state of Israel to Russia. Stalin was still alive, still in power. It was a quiet time. The show trials had ended 8 years before the doctor's plot was 5 years later. Trotsky was dead. Golda decided that the legation would be run like a kibbutz. Everyone would do the work for which they were best suited, but meals were to be taken communally, and each would take turns at chores. Small wonder that Golda's candidate for personal assistant wrote her the following. We shall have to be very comme il faut. So please, Golda, what about a fur coat for yourself? It's very cold there, and most people wear fur coats in winter. You need not buy yourself mink, but a good Persian lamb, and similar suggestions about evening dresses and warm nightgowns. After checking into the hotel, the fancy one provided for foreigners, and realizing they'd have to cook their own food on hot plates instead of eating in the extremely expensive dining room, Golda presented her credentials to Vyacheslav Molotov, Russia's foreign minister. Under Stalin's rule, repression of all religion was the rule. Advocacy of Zionism could land you in a penal colony. Yiddish newspapers and schools were closed, and Jewish actors, profession, and other Jewish, quote, intellectuals, unquote, which was a bad thing to be whether you were Jewish or not, were arrested and imprisoned. An elderly man bumped deliberately into Golda on the street and whispered for her to follow him. He led her away from the crowd And when they were isolated, he turned and recited the Hebrew prayer of thankfulness, then quickly walked away. On Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, the synagogue was mobbed. That's this one. More than twice the usual population, 5,000 people, weeping and laughing, were there because of Golda, because of the state of Israel. Golda and Sarah attended a reception given by Molotov and the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. Molotov's wife, Polina Zemchuzhina, was Jewish. Just an aside, but so was one of Imran Khan's. She greeted Golda in good Yiddish and asked Sarah many questions about the kibbutzim and Sarah's life at her kibbutz, Revavim. She put her arm around Sarah to wish her goodbye, saying, "If everything goes well with you, it will go well for all Jews everywhere." Golda never heard from her again. Years later, she learned that Mrs. Molotov was arrested for treason after that conversation and had disappeared. She was in a Soviet prison until Stalin's death in 1953. The Jews of Russia learned to keep away from Golda. And not surprisingly, Golda hated Moscow, and not the least of her misery was the bitter cold. She rejoiced when, 7 months after her arrival, Ben-Gurion offered her the position of Minister of Labor. This was right up her alley from her Histadrut days, and she happily put the dictatorship of the proletariat behind her and went home to determine how to employ and house and feed the 635,000 new immigrants from Europe and from Arab countries, especially Yemen. Almost all were destitute, and many, if not most, were broken in health as well. This was what Golda was made to fix. Her years as Minister of Labor were, she said, the happiest in her life. Initial housing for the immigrants was in tent camps, intended to be temporary, but weren't completely replaced by permanent homes for several years. These dwellings had corrugated metal roofs. Can you believe it in Israel's climate? And were severely criticized, and justly so. But the vital ingredient for housing the immigrants was money, which was missing, and so Golda went back to America one last time. American contributions came through one more time, but Golda was worried about the future. Would Israel always be dependent on charity? How Zionist was that? The idea of Israel bonds was born then, and with President Truman and Henry Morgenthau enlisted in support, has carried through till today. Nearly 600,000 Arabs had fled Israel in 47-48. Many stayed but were displaced by the fighting. Their abandoned homes were appropriated as residence for displaced Jews and Arabs. As Minister of Labor, Golda was at the center of all of this. In my life, she recounts standing on the Haifa beach, trying to persuade the Arabs fleeing the Haganah to return home, despite their leaders telling them to leave and the British providing trucks to take them to the ships. Trucks to the ships. That was what was written. The same plea was broadcast by the Haganah in Haifa and repeated on leaflets dropped over the city. I guess the ships were in piers. Golda believed that the fleeing Arabs were afraid of being branded as traitors if they stayed in the Jewish state. And we shall move the slide. And here is Golda with Ben-Gurion. In 1954, the Prime Minister of Israel, more sips. David Ben-Gurion, the man who had guided Israel into statehood, was tiring. He retired to a kibbutz to herd sheep and live a quiet life, appointing Foreign Minister Moshe Sharett to finish out his term, although the two of them didn't get along. In the government, there were many cleavages now that external pressures were lessening. Ben-Gurion appointed Golda to fill Sharett's spot as foreign minister. Not a quiet tenure for her. In 1956, President Abdel Nasser of Egypt made good on his many threats to nationalize the Suez Canal. It was a major blow to international maritime trade. Egypt and Syria both invaded Israel. France offered to supply Israel with arms for a Sinai campaign, which would be a vital element of the French and British attempt to restore the canal to international use. Golda was sent to France to join the group secretly negotiating this with the French government, which promised to supply air defense of Israel if needed. This war was the Suez War. In 4 days, the IDF reached the Golan, Israeli Defense Forces, reached the Golan Heights in Syria and to the west, captured the Gaza Strip, the whole of the Sinai Peninsula, and made a beachhead west of the canal. The resort hotels on the Gaza beach were yet to be. And Golda, touring the Sinai by car afterwards, said it was only then she really understood the extent of their victory, the sheer size and desolation of the territory through which these tanks, half-tracks, ice cream trucks, private cars, and taxis had raced. 30,000 Egyptian soldiers were found wandering around in the sand, of which 5,000 were taken as prisoners in exchange for an Israeli taken prisoner by the other side. But 172 Israeli soldiers died, 800 were wounded. The French and British were unable to liberate the canal. As for Israel, which had hoped for peace even more than territorial expansion, there was none. Like Groundhog's Day, there were another Arab-Israeli war in each of the 2 following decades, the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, making 4 in all, counting the 1948 invasions. Israel almost lost the last one. The day before Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, Israel Prime Minister received a message from military intelligence that the Soviet advisors in Syria were packing their bags and hurrying to get out of the country. Exactly this had happened before the Six-Day War, and it gave her flashbacks. The prime minister was Golda. She called the intelligence headquarters, but they assured her that nothing was afoot. Because it was hours from Erev, the evening before Yom Kippur, she hesitated to call the cabinet and all the soldiers away from their last meal before the fast, especially since she seemed to be the only anxious one. She later wrote, given such total certainty, it would have been unreasonable of me to have insisted on a call-up. But I know I should have done so, and I shall live with that terrible knowledge for the rest of my life. The phone call announcing the simultaneous Egyptian and Syrian invasions came at 4 a.m. The Egyptians had already crossed the canal. By 8 a.m., the Israeli generals Dayan and Dado were debating strategy. There would be a full call-out. They asked Golda for a preemptive strike air, but she refused because it would make Israel seem the aggressor and thus lose any chance of the massive help they need for their survival. And who recognizes these guys? Though it was costly to hold fire, Israel's best friend held firm. Golda has kind words for Henry Kissinger, thinking nobody else does at this point. A massive airlift of arms came from America and turned the tide. There was considerable Arab backlash, one result of which was that me, child of urban Brooklyn, now mother of 2 preteens in suburban Jersey, had to borrow her daughter's bicycle and teach herself to ride it. Yes, that was the year of the oil embargo. Tragedy, 2,056 Israeli soldiers died. Numbers like that hadn't been seen since the War of Independence, and Golda was brutally criticized for the state of unpreparedness that contributed to those deaths. It came out that hostile forces had been observed massing on the Golan Heights for days, and yet no action had been taken. She was excoriated for rejecting Anwar Sadat's peace proposals, because they required a return of the territories occupied by Israel during the war. She felt that returning to the past was ensuring a future exactly like the past. In 1965, Golda was diagnosed with lymphoma. She'd continued in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and secretary of her political party, MAPE, an acronym of the Hebrew for Party of the Workers of Israel. But her health prevented her from taking a more public role. Nonetheless, after the death of Prime Minister Levi Eshkol in 1969, a coalition in the Knesset chose her to succeed him. By 1973, even though a commission cleared her of direct responsibility for the gross failure of intelligence that nearly lost the war when it began, the coalition that had backed her came apart. Golda couldn't get enough votes in the Knesset for a second term, despite Mape's superiority at the polls. She was tired and she was ill. So she resigned as prime minister, and she resigned from the Knesset as well. It was time to rest. And one last slide. I'll end with one of my favorite Golda quotes. We thank the Lord, but why did he lead us through the desert and the wilderness to the one place in the Middle East that has no oil? Well, Golda, if you're listening, Israel's got lots of sunshine, and sunshine is the next big thing. He knew what he was doing. And that's it. So now I will end my presentation and open this up for discussion in which I am not participating.
Hi, I asked to unmute everybody, so go ahead. Whoever wants to speak, please go ahead and unmute. Maybe raise your hand and we'll unmute you as well. But I've then asked for everybody to get unmuted. Ilana, you have a question?
No, I just want to say that Maurice worked for my father's bookstore in Jerusalem, and then he opened his own bookstore. This was in the 40s when Golda moved to Tel Aviv from the kibbutz, and he stayed in Jerusalem after his work with Solel Bonnet. And we could never understand how she could have an affair when she was so ugly. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I can say that. So anybody else has any questions, please go ahead and speak.
Another comment. She was a very heavy smoker. She died at the end from that. She, one after another cigarette. That's, I don't know, I didn't remember that Jane talked about that.
No, I didn't. But she was photographed more than once with a cigarette in her hand. People didn't realize at the time.
She would lit one with the other, like my father. I mean, that was the age. My father published her book in Israel, so I knew her intimately towards the end of her life. I knew her even before, but Jerusalem was a small town at that time.
Thank you.
Okay.
Nice, good stuff to know.
I think there's a question comment. Thank you, Jane. Very well done. As Mary Christine saying, good.
Okay, thank you.
I probably heard somebody want to speak, but I just wanted to say something. Have anybody watched the recent movie about um
With
Golda Meir? There was a scene
Helen
where
Mirren, yeah.
so there was a scene where uh she heard that the Russians were helping Egyptian Air Force and blockading Cairo with I don't know if it's balloons or whatever the defense is. And they also tried to attack Israeli Air Force. And she said, when I was a small girl, my uncle or dad was afraid of Cossacks, Russian Cossacks. And I think Jane had said something regarding she didn't like Stalin and she didn't like particularly Russia in that regard, that she was threatened as a little girl, a little Jewish girl, by the pogroms, I guess. At that time, I don't know if it's the same time, Kishinev pogrom had just happened. And that was one of the major pogroms. And also during the Tsar's time, um, I don't know if anybody knows, the the Jews were living in a pale of settlement. They were not allowed to live in St. Petersburg or Moscow during Tsar's time. And also during the war between Japan and Russia, Jews had a special regiment where I forget what they called, where the Jewish boys were taken from their families and raised to be almost to convert, almost like Yanichars in Istanbul, and they will assimilate Jewish boys into the army. I don't know if anybody heard about something like that. Obviously, Troubadour was a famous Jewish soldier who, after POW in Japan, was freed in 95. Then there's a couple other ones that
That's where he
became
lost his
instrumental in
arm.
Jewish.
That's where Trumpeldor lost his arm in the Japanese-Russian War.
Correct. But then at the same time, it's almost interesting that the Russian Tsar was so discriminatory that he literally pissed off the whole Japanese society. I mean, not just didn't hate Jews, he hated Japanese, he hated everybody. It was just a society like that. It was disgusting, where they called Japanese macacas, which means monkeys, and and obviously was defeated by Japan, and it also supplied by the Jacob Schiff, who was a Wall Street um, entrepreneur investor who gave money to Japan to defeat Russia, and he was Jewish, so that I think poured more oil in the water in that regard. And I think Japanese also treated Jewish POWs special because of Jacob Schiff, American entrepreneur, supplying uniforms to Japan. So that's an interesting aspect as well. In that. So does anybody has any more questions, or I see that there's a couple of more. Thank you, Jane.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity.
No. I mean, hold on. I mean, it's good to. So now you said that, Jane, you don't want to be participating in discussion. Is it because of what's happening today? I mean, it's obviously.
Yes. Oh my God. Half of my friends aren't speaking to the other half.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty. I wouldn't say controversial. Obviously, it's not controversial. Where I think, to me, both sides went a little far. I mean, we should stop the war at this point. I don't know. Anybody wants to comment regarding the Meir being wise, Golda Meir being wise, and at the same time, how would she handle today's conflict?
I want to say that she took responsibility and she resigned after the Yom Kippur War. And Bibi is not taking responsibility, blaming the army, the intelligence, blaming everybody else. But since my grandkids are fighting right now, and Israel cannot allow another October 7, there is not really choice. I mean, it's terrible that they were not planned. They didn't have enough plans to avoid civilian casualties. And some crazies didn't permit the food convoys, crazies in the governments, the Orthodox. But you can't have another October 7 in Israel. So, and now they're finding, they cleared Shifa originally when they were in the north in November. The Hamas went back into Shifa hospital, and Israel caught a lot of Hamas, killed some. They have hostages, they have Hamas people, prisoners in Shifa, and they're getting a lot of information and intelligence from these people. And this is the way they have to go to Rafiah. They can't just indiscriminate bomb them. They have to do it the way they did the second invasion of the Shifa hospital. And I saw pictures of fighting in the hospital. So they're not doctors fighting, and they're not sick, ill people fighting. They're Hamas fighters fighting. And hopefully Israel will release the names of the higher-ups who were caught there so that it'll influence the release of Israeli hostages. That's what we hope.
My only comment on this is that, thank heavens I'm not living there now. And knowing what goes on, both sides lie all the time. Both sides lie like
Correct.
war is horrible. And this is how war is fought. We bombed Dresden and other places very badly, but of course that's us, you know. And knowing what's going on, where is the information? Maybe you're getting personally some information because you have relatives there, but for the rest of it, what am I going to do? I read the Times, I read Fox News, I read Haaretz, I read The Guardian. There's nothing helps, and Al Jazeera too.
Nobody said the US lost 3,000 people in 9/11. Over the years, US killed 176,000 in Afghanistan. Over the years, I mean, we stayed there too long. America stayed there too long. Nobody has any comments. Israel, the equivalent of 1,500, is more than 30,000 in the US. And also, we don't know how many of the 30,000 are Hamas people killed. They don't say that. Obviously, some terrorists were killed. They have soldiers, and they're all dressed in the same thing. They're not dressed in army uniform, so we don't know. And some of their families, their homes were bombed. Unfortunately, I mean, it wasn't very well planned, but we can say hindsight. We can always, and I'm going there in a couple of weeks, and my family is there, and my parents were refugees from, my father from Russia. He served in the First World War, and he hosted Trumpeldor in his room in Moscow. And my mother is a refugee from Hitler. So we have no alternative.
I admire your courage.
No alternative. I served in the army. I lived through the War of Independence. Israel accepted the United Nations partition. The Arab countries did not. They started a war and they lost. I was in Jerusalem without food and without water and with shells coming over, and I remember it vividly. So and they started the Yom Kippur War, and at the end Israel made through. And right now it's Hezbollah in the north. People don't realize it. Every day there are hundreds of rockets, so tens of rockets from Lebanon. And Israel is going to fight another war on the north side unless Hezbollah moves away from the border. They're all Iran agents.
So we have a comment from Sarah. Oh, no, it's fine. It's fine. Thank you for your feedback. Sarah Faradi, to everyone, just a comment that Golda Meir was accepted for her role as a female in politics. I just want to, I don't know if people are interested in, bringing parallels to what happened to Moscow, on Friday, where 4 gunmen from, I don't know, I guess they're ISIS-K, whatever they call them, went into the, I guess that was the concert that was happening in a mall, and they shot over 150 people. There's another 100 people, got burned because it was put on fire. ISIS claimed the responsibility. There's a lot of Russian media that states that, oh, that's different. Palestinians are fighting for their freedom, but they use the same tactics, right? They also attack the concert, and then there always a rebuttal from Russian media and throughout the world. Oh yeah, but there was a base nearby the trance concert that was happening in that kibbutz. So there's a parallel to how when people are relaxing, enjoy their life, somebody comes in and destroys that peaceful life. Obviously, we always have to separate, there's peaceful people and there's obviously people that want to cause trouble. But anybody wants to comment to, is there a parallel? Is there not a parallel? Hello? Yeah. I guess Jane, you want to say something about that, or?
Oh, terrorism is always with us. What can I say? I mean, it's so horrible that, and the reaction is so horrible, and the whole thing. When I think about it, and somebody having the guts to go back there and be in the middle of that, what can I say? It's easy to talk on this end.
I know. Okay, so then we'll move on from this subject. Maybe Ilana can comment on that. I don't know. Ralph, anybody wants to comment? Be free. This is a free discussion. Obviously, Jane did such an incredible work. Let's just commemorate by asking questions. Maybe have some insight. I really appreciate to Alana, talking about Troubadour. Sorry, and I forget who was this. Who was his contemporary who also went to Israel? Barzinski, I forget. Oh my gosh, who also helped Israel a lot. He was a Russian BOW in Japan. I forget his name is. In any case, I just want to also run a parallel between Margaret Thatcher and Golda Meir. Jane, can you comment? What would you say during the Falkland War, where the England, I would say, basically, how do you put it in the right way? Let the Argentina know that do not invade our country, even we have a small islands. Would you have parallels that they're two strong women, and in case they're patriotic to their cause, and we definitely need more people like that, the Margaret Thatcher and Golda Meir, in parallel to them.
What a question. I hope my talk was mostly about Golda Meir as a person, as a woman. And I read her biography, My Life, and I was just blown away by who she was and her capacity for love of the world, her sacrifices for it, and her use of whatever power she got in her ability, in her career to help people, how she used it. Margaret Thatcher, on the other hand, was the Iron Lady. And I don't think she was like a cactus. There was nothing. It's my contrast.
Okay,
We
so
also
that
had Indira Gandhi in India.
Indira Gandhi, well, we have to do that one next. We just actually did
Oh, no, not me. Look,
Benazir.
contrast with Benazir Bhutto. They were both, I mean, Indira Gandhi was not the child of Mahatma Gandhi or indeed any relation. She married
No, no,
somebody
no.
named Gandhi. She is a total contrast to Golda. Golda, it took socialism as her daily bread and Zionism from a very young age and carried on with it until she went to Russia and then saw the reality. But on the other hand, Indira played at Inqilab Zindabad and stuff like that, basically did very little for India. And I don't want to be the one to talk about her.
So how about doing something like off the beat? So there was an interesting queen in India. She was Kipchak, that came from Central Asia, and because her father had no, I mean, he had boys. He was able to. Her father was Muhammad, who pass on the making her queen. I forget her Kipchak. Her name is I'll tell you who it is. She's actually very famous in India because she was very fair. Kipchak queen in India. She actually is related to. Do you know Al Bars, who was the Mamluks king who defeated Mongols in Middle East, and stopped them from moving further into Egypt. He was an Egyptian king.
I
So,
don't know her. I
uh,
mean, I'd love to do one on Hildegard of Bingen or
oh, we could.
possibly Babur's mother.
Oh, yeah, we could do that. And Babur was a grandson of Timur Lame.
He was related to Genghis Khan on the other side of his family.
Correct. He was Timur Lame's grandson. And
Uh-huh.
Timur, yeah, he was. Um, he was. Timur Lame at one point was a had more land than current Russia. That was how big he was. Um, Kuman Queen. Yeah. I'll send you a name of her. I mean, she's. I was recently reading about her. I just forget her name, but she was from Kuman Opchak people, and she was a queen of India for like 30 years.
Oh, I'll see if I can find her.
Yeah, and then she's related to Akbars, who was the Mamluk king. The Mamluks were standing for slaves, so they all started as slaves, and they made their way um they made their way to to being sultans. And now in India they have huge monuments to her because and again there was the same story as with Golda Meir. She also had an affair, and to make it worse things worse, she had an affair with an African, this Kumchi Kipchak, a queen in India. So a lot of the Muslim nobility was like, against her because they felt like she wasn't with their own people. It's almost like we did the Cleopatra, right? I mean, Cleopatra was Greek, and because she was Greek, the recent movie that came out where they portraying her to be African, and so there was a lot of issues in Egypt and people in Europe that they gave such low reviews to the movie. But who cares? Really cares? The actress was amazing. The series was amazing. I mean, people are just too sensitive, you know.
Oh, I just got there was just a thing on the chat. They want to know how we can, they can find the old talks on YouTube. So maybe you could give them
Sure,
directions for
sure,
that.
sure. I'll give them a link right now. And also, just to reiterate, next week, on Saturday, another one of our alumni is doing a talk on Medes, who were predecessors of Archimedean Empire and Cyrus the Great. So, if you guys know, originally our group actually started as a very ancient people's talk, and then we could progress into the biography, and then Jane created her own series in, powerful women and doing various things as well. Like I said, she did a mind culture, which you definitely need to check out. I'm gonna do a link right now, send a copy of the link right now, and then you guys can check it out. So her mind talk is amazing. I hope she's gonna do it at seconds at some point. I don't know if you try, if how do you feel about seconds at some point, Jane?
Send me, email me with her name so I can research her, and then I'll be able to.
Okay. Her name is Han Koten, which is Koten.
K-O-T-E-N.
Ten. Yeah. Han, Han, Khan, and then Koten, Koten.
Concoten.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
I'll look her up.
she
But
was a
right now,
Kuman. Yeah, she was a Kuman queen of India and you can imagine how big of a population. It's the biggest country in the world right now in population.
uh,
She was the queen for a long time, like 20, 30 years, and her father preferred her over his five sons. And we're talking about this about 1300s, 1400s. So
oh,
that's yeah. So she was very strong, very fair, and people rebelled on her side. And then the most important thing she did when they chose her brother to be a king, she came outside and like basically in black clothes saying like, you guys have chosen somebody who is gonna, basically will destroy this country. And sure enough, her father became, her brother was a womanizer, drank a lot of alcohol, didn't care about the politics of his country, and she was a great politician. She actually brokered a lot of the, Hindu and Muslim relationships, and there's a lot of monuments to her regard, and they think of her as pretty pious. And then, I mean, in the end, I mean, she ended up being, murdered. But it was just, and then they hated the murderers. Like the same thing with Caesar and Brutus, right? After Caesar, died, basically they said, "Oh, what the hell happened?" And ended up, Mark Antony, that's his general, ended up going on a throne. Not after fighting with Cleopatra and stuff like that. So some similar, like people regretting that strong leader had passed, and they made a mistake. It happens, but in we're talking about Roman culture where it was almost like a Sicilian mafia. You don't leave on your own, you die, or from the knife, or from the Praetorian Guard or whatever type of things. It was
well,
it not none of
I,
the emperors ever ended up being being what you might call it, leaving on their own, pretty much. It was only few, and then didn't matter. Those if they were like, there was one emperor right after Caligula, his uncle, who they say was pretty good, but he was scared of everything. Didn't want to expand the, I forget his name. He wanted to expand the empire, and he just ended up dying of his own age because he didn't really go into against anybody. I mean, Caesar was pretty notorious, right? I mean, he brought a horse. Oh, it was the Caligula brought a horse into the parliament, and he said, "I'm going to make her one of the speakers." Right, the horse, and then he basically insulting everybody.
well,
Uh,
actually, I think Claudius died of poisoned mushrooms. Didn't I go over that in my talk?
that was Claudius. That's right. Yeah, but he was like he was only. This is so funny. When Caligula dies, they like literally round him from somewhere. He was like, "I don't want to be an emperor." I was like, "No, no, no, no. You have to be an emperor." he was like, I'm pretty content living my own life. I mean, after this, flamboyant Caligula with, oh my God, he was crazy completely. I mean, they still, I don't know if it's true, how true it is, but they still like, he had crazy orgies in a part in his own palace. And one time, when is it Nero or Caligula, when he burned the Rome, and he said finally, and then when he built his own palace over the burned Rome, he said finally I can live like a human. Like you
That was
burned,
Nero.
it was Nero, right? He was is playing on a flute while Rome is being burned, and
Yeah.
then when he was killed, is that another artist is being extinguished. Yeah. I was like, I
I'm
want.
going to leave and get something to drink, take care of my throat. But thanks everybody who showed up, and I'm very happy to see you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. All
Thank
right,
you.
thank you. Have a nice one, guys. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.